Splendessa. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2024 Mary Robinson Speaker Series event. The Resource Center's Mary Robinson Speaker Series began in 2010 and has run every year since, bringing together experts from business, government, NGOs, workers, and communities to explore the most pressing business and human rights issues of the day. This year's event, Business is Never Neutral, focuses on corporate responsibilities in conflict and crisis, what's expected of all corporate actors in these challenging contexts, and what opportunities exist for business to play a constructive rights-respecting role in them. Sadly, the panel could hardly be more timely with conflict raging on so many fronts. Our discussion will begin with a keynote speech from Marwa Fatafta. Marwa is Palestinian and serves as the Policy Advocacy Director for Middle East and North Africa at Access Now. This will be followed by an opening intervention by Volker Turk, the UN Human Rights Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. We will then move to a panel of expert speakers engaging in conversation with one another, and then with all of you in a Q&A session. We'd like to invite you to write and post any questions you have in the Q&A function throughout the keynote speech and panel discussion, and we'll curate the questions to put to the panel to get through as many as possible. We encourage you to direct your question to particular speakers if appropriate. We'd also like to invite you to post on social media about the event using the hashtag BHR Speaker Series. That's BHR Speaker Series. Okay, with that housekeeping out of the way, we're incredibly fortunate to be joined today by the chair and namesake of this event, who I have the special privilege of introducing. Mary Robinson was the first woman elected as President of Ireland and served from 1990 to 1997. She was then appointed to be the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. She is currently chair of the Elders, an independent group of global leaders who use their collective experience and influence for peace, justice, and a sustainable planet. Mary is a great friend and a trusted advisor to the Resource Center, and it's a delight to have her with us today to open this event. Mary, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this warm introduction, and to the Business and Human Rights Resource Center for hosting this dialogue. Today, as you said, marks the 15th iteration of this annual series, a decade and a half of identifying and analyzing the most pressing business and human rights concerns together as a global movement, and especially through the eyes of frontline defenders of human rights. Over this period, the exponential rise in companies' impact, influence, and fortunes, which today outstrip those of many countries in which they operate, has been accompanied by similar growth in demand for greater transparency and accountability from those same corporate actors. I'll reflect in a moment on the progress that's been made in this respect. Let me begin with the observation that there is perhaps no circumstance where corporate transparency and accountability are more important than business operations in supply chains in conflict. There can be no question that today the world faces some of its greatest challenges to date. This includes accelerating climate change, unsustainable inequality, the deliberate shrinking of civic space for peaceful protest, and intensifying geopolitical tensions with authoritarian regimes and anti-democratic leaders taking advantage of these deepening fault lines that they create and fan the flames of conflict. Too often, this is enabled by the collaboration, complicity, or willful blindness of a powerful private sector. And this is why the roles and responsibilities of businesses operating in conflict around the world are now an international collective action concern. Exploring these private sector responsibilities is our task today. The briefest scan of media headlines reveals that the moment for this discussion is tragically ripe. As I open today's proceedings, we are witnessing extraordinary suffering by civilian populations in the grip of war across the world. In Ukraine, where Russia's aggression has led to massive destruction of infrastructure, full-scale disruption of access to essential goods and services, and the deadly contamination of fully a third of its territory with landmarks and unexploded ordnance. In Myanmar, where development indicators continue to plunge amid widespread oppression following the 2021 military coup. Our keynote speaker, Marwa Fatafta, will reflect on Israel's assault on Gaza, where Palestinian death toll stands at nearly 40,000 and rising, amid a merciless, disproportionate Israeli response to the horrific Hamas terrorist attacks of the 7th of October. Meanwhile, there is the unspeakable tragedy of Sudan's war, a neglected war where more than 10 million people have been forced to flee their homes. A famine looms, and both sides of the conflict purportedly bombard civilians, recruit children, and inflict starvation as a weapon of war. In themselves, these descriptions must be devastating to any observer. But it is even more concerning that in each of these cases, a private sector is thriving, certainly benefiting from and frequently fueling these conflicts, while clinging to the opacity that these chaotic environments provide. In Ukraine, where the Resource Center has reached out to over 400 companies about their human rights practices and policies in conflict, a mere 11% of these companies have even bothered to respond. In Gaza, the United Nations has recently called on arms companies and their investors to end the transfer of their deadly products to Israel immediately, or risk responsibility for human rights violations, to similar silence by the private sector in response. In Sudan, too, a recent report reveals that the flow of weapons into the country has substantially worsened that crisis, while undermining clear consensus on the corporate responsibility to respect human rights throughout global operations. And in Myanmar, extraction of critical minerals for export continues at pace, raising serious questions about the role of global supply chains in compounding and prolonging deadly conflict. Our keynote speaker, Marwa, together with expert members of today's panel, will provide specific reflections on the roles of corporate actors in some of these conflicts, as well as their attendant responsibilities and risks where they fall short. But 3 points bear mentioning here. The first, as various UN bodies have repeatedly emphasized, is that business is never neutral in conditions of conflict. To the contrary, it has specific international responsibilities. Companies must demonstrate and report on heightened human rights due diligence regarding their operations and value chains to ensure that they do not contribute to the drivers of conflict, nor the triggers that intensify violence. This applies to conflicts between states as well as internal conflicts like Myanmar and Sudan. In this context, it's worth considering Azerbaijan, where the world will gather in a few months for COP29. Some of that country's powerful foreign business partners, and particularly in oil, gas, and renewable energy, operate in too close to arms where its Armenia population in Nagorno-Karabakh have been driven from their homes. People, the ICC prosecutor, have actually characterized as actions of genocide, victims of genocide. And there's a question that heightened human rights abuse due diligence responsibilities must exist for those companies operating there. The second point is that those responsibilities are now well-developed international human rights standards for business and provide clear guidance. International human rights standards for business provide clear guidance on the bounds of accountable corporate action in conflict. We're long past the days of business understanding the right thing to do, but not knowing how to do it. Some of the most important guidance for businesses to follow in these volatile environments is that heightened human rights due diligence must be conducted systematically and periodically to ensure that products and services are not used in violation of international law. If companies intend to profit out of a conflict, a one-time tick-the-box approach to due diligence is simply insufficient and may well turn out to be criminal. Fortunately, as we'll hear shortly, better practice by both business and investors in line with this guidance is possible. But my third point is that governments also have a critical role to play in making this better business practice not only possible, but compulsory. Against the background of suffering I've described moments ago, it's indisputable that our leaders must insist on the use of every tool in the toolbox in the business and human rights toolkit to ensure that civilians aren't harmed for the sake of strong quarterly returns. They must demand heightened human rights due diligence, risk mitigation, and stakeholder engagement with rights holders themselves by the private sector. They must hold companies accountable where they fall short, as they so often do. Now, while I have painted today a challenging picture of what the world is facing, history tells us that there is a battle for human rights to be won. We can and we should demand from corporate actors and the states in which they operate or are based a rapid shift away from approaches that prioritize profits over the safety and security of our most vulnerable populations. We've sought and secured these changes before. As I look back over the last 15 years that we have been holding these dialogues, I'm struck by what has been achieved. Adoption of the UN Guiding Principles for Human Rights and their increasing robust implementation by responsible business leaders and investors. Rising acceptance of the fundamental principle of human rights and environment due diligence, including the recent passage of the EU's Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Directive, and similar initiatives underway around the world. A process initiated to create a binding treaty on business and human rights, and increasingly effective demands by shareholders, by consumers, by workers, and frontlines communities for a private sector that not only respects human rights, but contributes actively to their realization and to an idea of shared prosperity between companies and their communities and workers directly impacted by them. And while we're still far from eliminating abuse, these milestones represent important progress towards zero tolerance of human rights abuses in business operations and supply chains. Responsible business and investors must continue to leverage their influence to prod the laggards towards improvement. Conflict zones are no exception. To the contrary, these are precisely the circumstances and environments in which expectations of business are highest, and where human rights and environmental rights due diligence must be at its very most robust. This will aid in ensuring that business is a force for good, not a catalyst for further suffering. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Marwa Fatafta, here to speak to us today on these issues in this year's keynote speaker, Marwa Fatafta. I have the pleasure of introducing her. Marwa leads Access Now's work on digital rights in the Middle East and North Africa region as the MENA Policy and Advocacy Director. Her work spans a number of issues at the nexus of human rights and technology, including the role of new technologies in armed conflicts and humanitarian contexts, and their impact on historically marginalized and oppressed communities. Marwa is also a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, an advisory board member of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy and advisory committee member for Bread and Neck. Mara was a Fulbright scholar to the US and holds master's degrees in international relations and development and governance. As we consider the vital shifts towards better business practice in the context of conflict today, I'm really delighted to welcome Marwa to share her valuable experience as a rights holder and an activist on these issues. So please join me in welcoming Marwa.
Thank you very much, Mary, for the warm introduction. And I'm honored to be here. And thank you for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center for shedding a spotlight on one of the grimmest and darkest episodes of our history as a Palestinian. We're now approaching 1 year of genocide in Gaza, 341 days of relentless mass slaughter and destruction of levels and intensity, according to the UN, not seen since World War II. I've struggled to put together a list of statistics to quantify the hell the people in Gaza have been living through. The list would be too long, but it will suffice to conjure the image of helpless parents collecting the body parts of their slain children in plastic bags, or the 9-meter deep crater left by 2,000 pound bombs dropped on displaced people sheltering in tents, to capture the level of horror and abhorrent crimes committed by the Israeli occupation in broad daylight, in full impunity, and with the full support and complicity of powerful actors, state and corporations alike. And while people in Gaza are being mercilessly starved, displaced, and killed in the most brutal and unimaginable ways possible as we speak, businesses and corporate actors that supply, enable, and silently profiteer from this war must no longer be allowed the privilege to look away. In particular, we must interrogate the role of tech companies in Gaza. In many instances, their products and services are familiar to all of us, benign in some cases, and even meaningfully contributing to the world. But these companies cannot escape their responsibilities for how their technologies are also being used in the most dystopian and harmful ways by warring parties. Nor can they ignore their responsibilities for the human rights consequences and suffering when these technologies are misapplied or used to these ends. And this includes the role of big tech in perpetually facilitating grave violations of international law as the Israeli government continues to test and deploy its dehumanizing technologies on an entrapped, besieged population. These have included household names like Google, Amazon, and Meta, as well as many others. And the allegations have included provisions of AI capabilities and cloud computing services to the Israeli authorities to store intelligence information collected via mass surveillance of the people in Gaza during this war, facial recognition technologies reportedly used by the Israeli forces to identify, detain, and torture Palestinians, including women and children, social media platforms facilitating the silencing of Palestinian and pro-Palestinian voices, including activists and journalists in Gaza who are risking all to tell the world about the genocide that is happening on their doorsteps. And on the same platforms, incitement to genocide, hate speech, online attacks, and explicit calls for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, calls that we as Palestinians know very well can be fully executed without any question or pushback, have run rampant. And at a minimum, these companies ought to know and help prevent the reality that online hate speech against any people is likely to contribute to offline harms. Despite this long list of documented abuses, multiple warnings from various UN bodies, a pending case at the ICJ, protests from their workers, tech companies have, by and large, continued to conduct their business as usual in the region. All these examples I mentioned demonstrate how companies are not, and can never be neutral in times of conflict. Their policies, actions, and services are not cut to one size for all. One cannot help but point to the discrepancy, and dare I say even hypocrisy, of tech companies' reaction between conflicts and their silence, let alone profiteering from the war in Gaza, but also in Sudan and other conflict-ravaged countries in the global majority world. As Mary mentioned, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights provide clear guidance to businesses operating in armed conflict zones where they risk being complicit in gross human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law committed by other actors. And responsible conduct in times of war means that companies should avoid causing or contributing to human rights abuses and to mitigate these harms and risks that are directly linked to their business operations and relationships. This happens through conducting heightened human rights due diligence. They must assess on a regular basis and throughout the life cycle of a conflict how their actions, products, and policies may alleviate or exacerbate violence and conflict dynamics. And where they cannot mitigate such risks, they should terminate their business relationship with the actors involved in such violations. Despite their public commitments to these principles, big tech companies have not only failed to conduct such due diligence. In the context of Gaza, it's been 11 months. I have not seen a single effort in that regard. They also refuse to meaningfully engage with civil society and rights holders and have ignored multiple requests for transparency from civil society, including from my organization, Access Now, and also the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Now, particularly in conflict, the stakeholder engagement is important, especially where access to those on the front line is limited. And even worse, some companies have retaliated against and fired their workers for protesting against such complicity. I'll take this opportunity to remind companies that your commitment to human rights is not about glossy paged reports, nor a box-ticking due diligence exercise, or an elective you apply when it's opportune or convenient for you. This is about real human beings, and in times of conflict, it's about life and death. And there's an opportunity to do so much better. Wars and conflicts are often a litmus test to our values and our ability to adhere to the standards we've committed ourselves to as humanity when we said never again. And what we often forget at the very heart of our human rights system is prevention. This is also the underpinning spirit of the UNGPs. Companies should not wait until the ICJ rules that what is happening in Gaza is indeed a genocide to hurl out human rights policies or apologies as they did in the situation of Myanmar. And if your only concern is profit, then genocide is bad for your business too. And be assured that not only will history be unkind to you, but so will your users, your investors, and your workers. And burying your head in the sand, pretending not to know, or resorting to the old and retired rebuttal lines will not absolve you from your responsibilities. In July this year, the ICJ finally determined that Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories is unlawful, and that states are required to ensure an end to this illegal occupation and the full realization of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. They're also obliged not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by Israel's illegal presence in the occupied territories. And I'd argue the same should apply to corporations that have long maintained business relations with and profited from Israel's illegal occupation. And here I echo the calls made by the UN Special Rapporteurs for an arms embargo and ends to all other commercial activities that may damage the Palestinians, targeted sanctions, including asset freezes on Israeli individuals and entities involved in illegal occupation, racial segregation, and apartheid policies. And to investors, this includes banning trade and investment in Israeli settlements, as well as banning investment in Israeli companies and banks that are contributing to maintaining Israel's unlawful occupation, including companies that produce surveillance technologies, weapons, and policing equipment. And to end my keynote speech, I thought it's very fitting to share a quote from Gaza. And he says, "I do not care if I die in one piece, or if my head isn't above my neck, carried in a bag, covered with a shroud, cut in half, buried deep under the rubble, not found, recognized by face, or an unknown body. It's all the same to me. I no longer wish for a grave with my name on it. I'm so fine with being buried in the streets, backyards, or left behind. This doesn't terrify me. What terrifies the hell out of me is not being killed. What terrifies me is staying alive after all of this. And this is what terrifies me too. What world are we creating in which such horrors are enabled and sponsored in full impunity? And where companies have the luxury to simply dismiss these grave human rights violations while touting they care about human rights on their websites? We cannot allow the elimination of a people to continue, and we cannot allow those facilitating such destruction to go unnamed, unblamed, and unaccountable. And companies have a role to play here, and the time is to take action is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Marwa and Mary, for your powerful presentations and for setting the tone for today's panel discussion. I now have the privilege of turning the floor over to Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who will open our panel discussion and then depart for another engagement. The High Commissioner has devoted his long and distinguished career to advancing universal human rights, notably the protection of some of the world's most vulnerable people. Prior to taking up his current role, he was the Undersecretary General for Policy in the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General, where he coordinated global policy work. Over the course of his career, he has held several key positions at UNHCR headquarters, as well as around the world in Malaysia, Kosovo, the DRC, and Kuwait. High Commissioner, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Great, many thanks, dear Mary, distinguished panelists, dear colleagues, dear participants. It's really a pleasure to be speaking at this event in honor of Mary Robinson. And she's really one of the clearest voices that we have in global affairs. And indeed, the topic of the discussion today is intensely relevant to the current rapid disintegration that we see on peace, on security, and development in many countries around the world. As I mentioned to the Human Rights Council just a few days ago, it was sort of a mid-term reflection in my mandate. I really think we are at a fork in the road. On the one hand, we could continue to hurtle down an increasingly steep slope towards generalized conflict and suffering. We could continue to trample the international legal obligations that were set up by our forebears to protect the world's people from unbearable violence and harm. We could continue to empower the voices of hate, to goad people into dehumanizing others based on trivial perceived differences. We could continue to finance and enable a thick smog of disinformation that suffocates facts and chokes off people's ability to make informed choices. We could continue to finance arm and facilitate the use of violence by security forces and armed actors to silence critical voices, to commit abuses, to beat down legitimate demands for rights. We could continue to ignore and further fuel our triple planetary crisis, to sideline the imperative of equity sharing benefits of sustainable developments, or we could choose a better way. We could choose peace, justice, development that benefits, where the benefits are equitably shared. We could choose a world that is more respectful, more harmonious, because disputes can be fairly resolved, and more prosperous because there is greater stability and because of the ingenuity that flourishes from freedom. In other words, we could choose to be guided by the human rights that are inherent in every one of us, equally and universally. This choice is too important to be left to a small number of political leaders. Its implications will be felt by every community, perhaps even by every family, every individual in the years to come. Yes, governments have an essential and fundamental role in establishing transparent, accountable institutions and an effective, impartial rule of law, well-funded systems that deliver rights to everyone. But corporations also play a key role here, a role in contributing to whether people's rights are respected or denied, as we have just heard, a role in promoting social harmony and sustainable development, or a role in fueling hatred and conflict that become increasingly uncontrollable. Because, let me remind you, conflict is a chaos machine. It undermines institutions, it fuels the power and spread of lawless criminal gangs and extremist armed groups, and their activities frequently spill well beyond the borders of their country, as we have seen in Libya, Yemen, and elsewhere. It threatens world navigation and trade routes. It can create nuclear threats to people thousands of miles away, as we see with the war in Ukraine. And above all, it kills, maims, deprives, and impoverishes ordinary human beings, as we are seeing very painfully, and as we have just heard in Gaza, for example. literally millions of people, whether they are in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Myanmar, in Sudan, many other countries, are today facing intolerable pain because of conflicts that are clearly fueled or enabled, at least in part, by business interests. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, I was there a couple of months ago in the east. Companies engaged in resource grabs for rare and precious raw materials have been connected to armed groups whose predatory violence has pushed millions of people off their lands. Currently, close to 8 million people are internally displaced in the Democratic Republic of Congo because of conflict. The conflict in Sudan is not only a struggle for power, it is also driven by the business interests of both Sudanese and foreign actors, whose economic influence and rivalry have contributed to the war. Businesses controlled by the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces in the lucrative gold, agriculture, and livestock sectors have become the financial backbone of the war economy, funding the military operations and undermining peace efforts. In Myanmar, the army's war on its people is being enabled by a web of foreign businesses providing weapons, revenue, telecommunications, and other services and resources. In numerous countries, in every region, the operations, products, or services of the digital and tech companies have enabled the incitement and spread of hatred and deep, toxic social divisions. Many digital tools and services also underpin the violence of armed groups, entangling these companies in a complex web of responsibilities and duties. And regarding the occupied Palestinian territory, the International Court of Justice recently held that member states are under an obligation to abstain from entering into economic or trade dealings with Israel concerning the occupied Palestinian territory, which may entrench its unlawful presence there. In other words, businesses are not neutral actors in situations of conflict. Even where they do not directly participate, their simple presence and their operations will have some impact on conflict dynamics. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights provide a blueprint for responding to the inherently heightened risk of involvement in human rights abuses that is characteristic of challenging operating contexts such as armed conflicts. Key to this framework is the need for businesses to conduct human rights due diligence. It is vital in every situation for companies to invest the resources that are needed to properly assess each situation, to make strategic decisions about how to mitigate and manage risks that are based on human rights. In cases where the risk of involvement in grave human rights violations and abuses is especially high, more care and quicker action will be needed. Not only is it the right thing to do, increasingly it is also an obligation under domestic and regional laws. And it makes good business sense because it helps prevent reputational damage that can be very profound, including boycotts and protests, as well as exposure to litigation. This also applies to investors who, like any other business actors, have the responsibility to respect human rights. Investors, too, are expected to conduct human rights due diligence, to identify the risks of negative human rights impact, and to take action to address it. Whatever the context, human rights due diligence is the compass that can help each company devise its own solutions to fully respect the rights of people on the ground. And the guiding principles on business and human rights indicate the way for business leaders to reach conclusions that are morally and legally defensible. Last year, my office published a note that further clarifies the actions expected by businesses which operate in challenging contexts such as conflict, authoritarian regimes, political turmoil, or systematic violations of human rights. Decisions regarding whether or not to remain in a challenging context and how to respond to a deteriorating human rights situation are rarely straightforward. In some contexts, even in the face of public pressure to leave, the exit of a business enterprise may not lead to better outcomes for people on the ground. But the guiding principles do also clearly envision a role for consideration of disengagement, taking into account its potential adverse impacts where warranted. Colleagues, ultimately, business benefits from peace, from justice, from sound, stable institutions, from free, developed societies, and from a business reputation that is clean of any engagement in wrongful killing or human rights harms. All companies have a deep and overwhelming interest in participating in building societies that uphold fundamental human rights, in which the values of our common humanity can flourish in peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, High Commissioner, for your insights and for reminding us that business is never neutral and that business benefits from peace. Now, I want to welcome our distinguished panelists who will continue the discussion on these critical topics. The panelists include Ryo Mizuchi, an advisor at Kirin Holdings. From 2017 to 2024, he served as the Chief Sustainability Officer of Kirin Group. He's also currently a member of the Nurinchukin Bank Sustainability Advisory Board and the Japanese National Commission for UNESCO. Kiran Aziz, Head of Responsible Investments at Norway's largest pension company, KLP, responsible for ownership and responsible investment activities. She sits on various boards and is a columnist for Norway's largest online newspaper. Pichaman Yopantong is the Head of Research and Associate Professor at the Center for Future Defense and National Security, Deakin University at the Australian War College. She leads the Responsible Business Lab and the Environmental Justice and Human Rights Project and serves as a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And finally, Ella Skybenko is the head of Eastern Europe and Central Asia at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center based in Kiev, Ukraine. Ella leads the Resource Center's work on corporate responsibility in the context of Russia's military aggression against Ukraine. At the conclusion of this discussion, Resource Center board member Heather Grady will join us to facilitate the Q&A session. Heather is a vice president in the San Francisco team of Rockefeller Philanthropic Advisors and leads the practice area of environment and climate change. Please remember to put your question into the Q&A box as the discussion unfolds. If you want to direct them to specific panelists, please make that clear. I now have the pleasure of kicking off the panel with a question to Kiran. Kiran, as we've heard from Mary, Marwa, and the High Commissioner this morning, and as I'm sure you're seeing in your own work, conflict is rising around the world. This must inevitably affect the operations of your investee companies. In your role as head of sustainable investing, please comment on this reality and your expectations of these companies when they find themselves operating or providing services in conflict zones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the question. I would say, as a pension fund, we have a quite long-term perspective on given that we invest pension and saving money, where the objective is to derive the best possible return. And as we see it, that enable to increase the value, the underlying business activity must be responsible and sustainable. And based on this, we set quite clear expectations to the invested companies, especially to the boards and the management in these companies, because our expectations, they have the right and both obligations to take the wider shareholders' expectations into account. And we base a lot of our expectations on international law and standards such as the UN guiding principles in human rights, as it has been mentioned. And one of the core expectation is there that the companies, they have a quite clear duty to respect and protect human rights in every country in which they operate. And this is regardless of whether the government of that country complies with these rights. And as it has been addressed, conflicts can entail a particular high risk of human rights abuses. So I think the companies who are operating in these conflict areas, they should really exercise a caution to avoid becoming involved on these violations and make sure that they are doing every effort in order to protect vulnerable individuals. And it has been mentioned a couple of times, and I think I will remind that again, because performing due diligence is a really core expectation from us as responsible investors. And I think the due diligence, it's also important to remember that it must be tailored to the situation concerned, and especially in situations of war and conflict, enhanced due diligence is really a core expectations. And the other element is that we expect the companies to be transparent about this, because we as investor, we rely on decisions on information which is in the public domain. And one thing is that we can address that through dialogue with the companies, but on the other hand, we want the companies to be transparent. And I can see that, you know, companies' exposure to conflict areas of war, such as in Gaza, Myanmar, or Sudan, is really a core priority for us, because this is where we are getting the most attention from our owners and wider stakeholders, because we are being questioned about our investments. So by following up these companies, we are taking our responsibility. But I think the companies, they need to just be prepared for that they will be held accountable from the investor community, and there is a collective effort, because this is something not necessarily we are doing on a voluntary basis, because in a lot of countries this is becoming a part of regulation. So this is being an expectation, and from our point of view. But I can also maybe tell a little bit about how we would like to leverage the influence, because we work quite in a quite systematic way, that we, first of all, we would always like to influence company by engaging with the companies. And if it doesn't work, then exclusion is the last tool we have. And, you know, we will use all the tools, but it's important that the companies are given a fair chance to express. And, you know, it's the future risk which we will assess going forward.
Kieran, I think you may have a question for one of the other panelists.
Yes, sure. So, but I would like to ask to Rusik in terms of how you are expressing and, you know, living up to these commitments in conflict area.
Yes. So we had a business in Myanmar, and 4 days after the coup, we announced the termination of a joint venture with MEH PCL, which has a business ties with the junta, and because it was against a human rights policy to keep running a joint venture with a Myanmar brewery as a joint venture with an entity which has a business ties with junta. Our priority was to protect the livelihood of employees, customers, and suppliers. So Kirin originally proposed to buy out our joint ventures with MEH PCL. We believed we could best support our employees, customers, and suppliers by running Myanmar brewery without MEH PCL. But MEH PCL did not come to the negotiation table for many months. Instead, MEH PCL suddenly filed for the liquidation of Myanmar brewery in the Myanmar court. Kirin regarded liquidation as a worst case scenario because it would not only jeopardize the livelihood of Myanmar breweries' employees, customers, and suppliers, but also benefit MEHPCL by allowing it to acquire the liquidated assets at a very low book value later. So Kirin asked the Myanmar court to reject the request from MEHPCL and filed for arbitration with the Singapore International Arbitration Center. But we knew that the arbitration could take several years to be settled, and we were not able to keep working with MEHPCL for such a long time. That was why we had to give up our preferred option of buying out Myanmar Brewery and chose to exit from Myanmar as a last resort. In order to avoid the certain worst case of liquidation within a limited time frame, our withdrawal was the best feasible option. And that was what we discussed at Kirin board meeting. And unfortunately, Myanmar is not an isolated example. And there are many other conflict zones in the world now. And one of them is Ukraine, where Ella is from. Ella, may I ask, what role have corporations played in Ukraine, both poor and better? And what has it meant for the people of your country?
Thank you, Rio, and hello, everyone. I think it is important to note that there are two different contexts in which companies operate when we are talking about the Russian aggression against Ukraine. There is war-torn Ukraine, and there is the aggressor state of Russia. These are two very different contexts, and as a result, the risk companies are facing, as well as the impact their operations are having or may have on human rights or conflict, are also different. Companies operating in Ukraine, which is defending itself from the aggressor, face heightened human rights risks caused by the war, including risks to employees' physical safety and mental health, increased labor rights risks, lack of access to essential goods and services. But in most cases, their operations have no significant impact on the conflict itself. Meanwhile, companies operating in Russia have played and continue to play a critical role in enabling the Russian aggression because they cannot avoid contributing to its war effort. They do it either indirectly by paying millions of dollars in taxes that go into Russia's defense budget, or directly by helping the Russian government with its mobilization efforts. The mobilization law obliges all companies operating in Russia to assist the government in various ways, including delivering the summons to their employees, providing buildings, communications, land plots, transport, and information. Now, to understand how and why taxes contribute to the war effort, it is important to understand that Russia's economy is a full-fledged war economy. At the cost of spending on its people, Russia has doubled defense spending from 14% of the budget in 2021 to 29% this year. According to the Kyiv School of Economics, foreign businesses paid $40 billion in taxes to the Kremlin in the first 2 years of the war. And from 2025, the corporate tax will rise from 20% to 25% to help pay for the war in Ukraine. There are some examples of better corporate practice. A small number of companies, including Clifford Chance, Michelin, and Heineken, did manage to exit Russia responsibly, taking care of their employees and ensuring their businesses did not fall to state control. Yet over 1,000 companies from G7 countries are still doing business in Russia, helping it wage the war against Ukraine. There are also companies which are not present in Russia, but who help sustain Russia's war effort through the supply chains they support and the technologies they provide. Numerous investigations show that Russia is still receiving Western equipment and products critical for its military production. What all of this means for the people in Ukraine, this means endless suffering, lost lives, destroyed homes, kindergartens, hospitals, because 97% of Russian missiles, drones, and bombs hit civilian infrastructure. The Russian airstrikes have destroyed 80% of Ukraine's thermal energy generation. As a result of these airstrikes, millions of Ukrainians are deprived of access to essential goods and services, including electricity, water, internet, mobile connection. And the prognosis for the upcoming winter is horrifying. Why is the Russian army targeting civilian infrastructure? Because Russia is waging this war with the only purpose of destroying Ukraine, because Ukraine does not want to be part of Russia. The Russian army has committed 137,000 war crimes in Ukraine. And companies that continue operations in Russia, or those who support supply chains or provide technologies needed for weapons production, contribute to these crimes. And I strongly believe that sooner or later, these companies will be held accountable for their actions. And now I would like to turn to Pishamon. Having now heard my reflections on Ukraine, as well as Rio's analysis of business in Myanmar, I want to ask you about the efforts of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights on issues of business in conflict. The working group has also done a lot of thinking about the triggers and indicators that should lead to heightened human rights, heightened action by states, business, and the UN system where conflict emerges. Could you reflect a bit on some of this recent work and offer your perspective on the engagement, action, and receptiveness of companies in the working group's outreach to them? Over to you, Pishamon.
Thank you, Ella. As I'm joining you from Canberra, Australia, please allow me to first acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the lands on which I speak, and pay my respects to Ngunnawal elders past, present, and emerging. So this past month, I've had the opportunity to travel to Colombia for an official country visit and to the Philippines for an academic visit. In both countries, I heard numerous testimonies from victims and affected communities, many of whom are Indigenous, of the severe human rights impact of conflict and the alleged complicity of businesses. And so I'd also like to take this moment to acknowledge that the work that we do on business and human rights in the context of conflict has to invariably learn from the heartbreaking experiences of those who have suffered pain and loss. So to your question, Ella, indeed, the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, of which I am the Asia-Pacific member, has continued to seriously reflect upon the exigent business and human rights concerns raised by the devastating conflicts that we see today. And we are also still contemplating how accelerated and heightened action can be taken by states, businesses, and UN entities alike. We have also benefited from the work and insights of active communities of scholars and practitioners, including businesses themselves, that are working on this topic. And this is reflected in our thematic report on business, human rights, and conflict-affected regions, which spotlights in particular the need for businesses operating in conflict-affected situations to conduct heightened human rights due diligence, and the importance of ensuring access to effective remedies. The report, as you note, elaborates upon the triggers of heightened human rights due diligence, such as conventional armed conflict, military occupation, and gross human rights violations and abuses, as well as the various risk factors and indicators for heightened action. But rather than going into that, I'd like to direct your attention to the reality that we all now face, which is that the character of war is changing. Conflict is no longer just kinetic. And so what warrants greater focus is understanding when and how unconventional conflict, which is often based on the use of multi-domain tactics, triggers heightened human rights due diligence and necessitates heightened action by states and businesses. While unconventional warfare usually prioritizes psychological effects over physical destruction, activities such as cyber attacks, operations targeting critical infrastructure, and the weaponization of information can have as severe a material impact on civilian populations. And these wide-ranging effects are, of course, being witnessed in the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine, Myanmar, and the occupied Palestinian territory. As noted in our thematic report, and I quote, "There is no fundamental difference in outcome between a mining operation faced by the challenge of known local militias using their trucks to attack, rape, and kill members of a specific community and a social platform allowing known extremists to post hate messages inciting the attack, rape, and killing of members of a specific community. So one of the major challenges we now face is how we, as a business and human rights community, can ensure that heightened human rights due diligence and corporate accountability processes are evolving as quickly as, for example, the new emerging technologies being deployed in conflicts. Another is that given we are now well and truly in the cyber age, how can the requirements of the guiding principles be communicated effectively to those operating in the technology sector? Because while we see progress being made in other sectors to comply with the guiding principles and undertake heightened human rights due diligence, the technology sector is lagging behind when it comes to adopting a genuine rights-based approach. And so with that, I think we need to think more holistically in terms of the nature of the challenges we face, but also the lived experiences of those on the ground. And we also need to learn from positive examples where action has been taken in order to improve, mitigate, and address the human rights abuses that we see happening right now. And so with that, as I still have the floor, I'd like to actually go back to Kiran and ask a question about a specific action that's been taken by KLP. And Kiran, I'm of course referring here to KLP's decision to divest from Caterpillar in the context of its role in Palestine. So what are your reflections on what investors should do to ensure best practice by investee companies? And when do you think a divestment decision ought to be made? Over to you, Kiran.
Thank you very much. I would say that as investors, we should always try to engage with the companies in order to influence them through active ownership and keep raising the question, especially to the management. I think if more investors engage, it will be a collective effort, and you will also be able to send a signal to the company. But on the other hand, we also need to get some assurance that the active ownership is actually working and you are able to see some progress and how the future risk looks like. And like I said, that, active ownership is one tool, but exclusion is the other important tool. And I think it's also important to hold companies accountable in terms of exclusion if they are not able to show any progress in terms of risk management, or they are taking all expectations as responsible investors seriously at all, because it's about drawing the line somewhere. And if you look at the exclusion we did on Caterpillar, it was due to Caterpillar's products, use of Caterpillar's product and services, and this is their D9 series of bulldozer. They are being used to demolish Palestinian houses and infrastructure, and Caterpillar also being alleged that Caterpillar's equipment is being used in connection with the brutal war in Gaza. And when we were working with Caterpillar, thought that it might be a case for exclusion because we did not succeed with the engagement. We also used the recommendation, or the press release, which was from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on armed transfers to Israel, where several companies such as Caterpillar was mentioned. So I would say, these reports which are being conducted at the High Commissioner of Human Rights are quite valuable for us as investors, and this is also something I would urge other investors to use. And we do understand that it's not that we are not transforming the responsibility from the governments to the companies, but on the other hand, the companies need to live up to that. They are performing at least due diligence, and then they are able to give us a quite substantive, I would say, evidence on that they are making some effort. And in this case for Caterpillar, we do know that they do not sell equipment directly to the Israeli Defense Forces, but the company has been made aware of how its equipment is being used. And this has also been gone for a long time, I think, which is quite vital here. And the company has not been able to demonstrate that it has made any real changes. So I think the time aspect also indicates that the company is unwilling to take any steps. And I think one way I would also recommend the investors to do that is also about, you know, always taking the further questions on how the company's guidelines and commitments are being practiced in the areas of conflict, because it's important that we as investor, we can get a certain insurance. And I think this also illustrates that, you know, responsible investors, they work in a quite systematic way, but on the other hand, we demand transparency from the companies, but it is also, I would say it is also quite important that we as investors can live up to that transparency. And this is why when we excluded Caterpillar, we gave a quite thorough exclusion document to show that where we draw the line and that it could be of value for other investors and wider stakeholders. And I think lastly, I would say that, you know, we have all these standards, we have all these good best practices we can live up to, but we need to remember that, you know, rules will be just rule if we don't live up to them. But I would like to go back to you, Ella, because you mentioned, and you know, and the Resource Center has also undertaken quite significant work on the role of business in conflicts across the world, with particular focus on human rights due diligence. So, what have been some of your key findings about the need for strong rights-centered approaches by business in these contexts to ensure their activities do not contribute to adverse human rights impacts, given that a lot of investors also use the work which is being conducted at the Resource Center?
Thank you, Kiran. So in our work, we have been focusing on the role of business in 3 conflict-affected contexts: Myanmar, Russia's war in Ukraine, and Israel's war on Gaza. Our key findings are, number 1 is overwhelming lack of transparency. Response rates to our surveys on heightened human rights due diligence or outreach regarding alleged abuses by companies in these contexts have been consistently very low, ranging from 4% to 22%. The lowest in our history rate of 4% was in response to a survey among tech companies operating in or providing services to OPT and or Israel. Number 2 is lack of understanding by companies of their human rights obligations. Just one example, when we asked companies about actions taken in response to the implications of the Russian mobilization law, I've already mentioned, the law that obliges all companies to assist the government with the war effort, no company said it would consider withdrawing from Russia because of the law. Even though, according to the UNGPs, companies should consider exiting if there is little room for mitigating risks of involvement in adverse human rights impacts in contexts where national laws require actions inconsistent with internationally recognized human rights standards. The OHCHR guide says it may happen in the context where products or staff may be requisitioned for the furtherance of armed conflict. And this is exactly what is happening in Russia. Finding number 3 is lack of action by businesses, which obviously results from the lack of understanding of their human rights obligations. Also, just one example, every time we approach companies whose products were found in weapons used in Gaza or Ukraine, the most common response we receive is that they comply with all regulations and sanctions, even though sanctions can never replace due diligence. Finding number 4 is lack of action by states. Many Western governments continue doing business with aggressor states. For example, Russia gets 1/8 of its military budget from taxes on oil and gas bought by the European Union. Weak enforcement of export controls allows Russia to continue importing sanctioned dual-use goods and advanced technology critical for its military. It took the US government 2 years to issue a business advisory on risks associated with doing business in Russia. No EU country has yet issued a business advisory 2.5 years after the start of Russia's aggression. And finally, our finding number 5 is lack of clear authoritative guidance for companies operating in different conflict-affected contexts. I think what is missing is clear guidance that would point to salient risks companies should prioritize in their human rights assessments depending on the context in which they operate. While existing guides and tools are very useful in some contexts, they are not as helpful in others. What works in the context of civil war may not necessarily work in the context of the aggressor state that is waging a war against another state, or in the context of a country that is defending itself from the aggressor. The UN guidance on responsible exit is a good example because it focuses exclusively on harms versus benefits to people in a country from which a company is considering exiting, while completely ignoring the impact such an exit may have on people in another country in the context of the international armed conflict. The last issue I would like to mention is the lack of guidance on controversial issues such as taxation or essential goods and services. I'll be honest that, I mean, mentioning in a footnote that a business is involved with human rights violations in circumstances where it is a very significant tax contributor, without providing the definition of a very significant tax contributor is not helpful. I'm referring to the OHCHR guide here. For example, Raiffeisen Bank paid $491 million in profit tax to Russia in 2023 alone. So is this a significant enough tax contribution to be able to say that this company is involved with violations of the Russian government? The lack of guidance on these issues enable companies to justify their presence in aggressor states. Now I want to turn back to Rio on one of the points I've just mentioned for a bit more detail in respect of a real world example, and that is on the point of responsible exit. Rio, from your perspective, what does the obligation of responsible exit of an international business in a country facing internal conflict really mean? What role, for example, did stakeholder engagement and heightened human rights due diligence play in your decision-making about Kirin exiting Myanmar? And what were the key challenges you faced in executing the exit? Over to you.
Thank you, Era. By the way, Kirin entered the Myanmar market in 2015 when Aung San Suu Kyi was came back, went to power, and the country had been moving toward democratization. So Kirin was optimistic, and so we conducted a due diligence when entering the nation, but our due diligence is about Myanmar Brewery, our joint venture, not really so much about MEHPCL, our partner. We have to admit that we are quite naive in international business at that time. And as for exit, in our case, responsible exit should involve three objectives. One, to bring the least harm to innocent stakeholders such as our employees, customers, and suppliers. And two, to bring the least benefit to the junta. And three, to execute our fiduciary duty to our shareholder. So we proposed a buyback of all Kirin shared by Myanmar Brewery on three conditions. First, to employ a third party, a global accounting firm with high credibility, for a fair valuation of Myanmar Brewery, because a fair valuation assures the commercial neutrality of the transaction, which would neither benefit MEHPCL nor damage Kirin shareholders' value. And secondly, to guarantee the freedom of occupation and 12 months of continuous employment of the employees after the deal closure. And three, to give a special compensation equivalent to 3 months' salary to all employees. Last two conditions were expected to protect employees' livelihood and mitigate any negative impact. And eventually we were able to get an agreement from MEHPCL. Kirin had several engagements with ESG investors, and one of them was Norges Bank. As a result of engagements, Norges Bank put Kirin's stock in its probation list after the coup and lifted the probation after Kirin's exit. I think their judgment was very fair. The exit was Kirin's own decision, but I think investors like Norges Bank and KLP, which Kiran works for, can encourage companies to make right decisions through engagement. The engagement with human rights experts was also very effective. Kirin consulted with Chris Shidochi, an international human rights lawyer and one of the members of the United Nations fact-finding mission on Myanmar, when considering our strategy after the coup. Chris Shidochi gave us very insightful advice on a pro bono basis, not as a paid consultant, to preserve his independence. So I'd like to recommend businesses in conflict zones to seek advice from experts like Chris Shidochi and Pishamon today. So Pishamon, I'd like to ask you final questions, which are about legal obligation of companies in conflict zones under international humanitarian law. My first question is, are there mechanisms for holding companies accountable when they fail to comply with international humanitarian law? And next question is, do you think companies and investors are alert to the risk of becoming complicit in violations of international humanitarian law? Over to you, Pishamon.
Thank you very much for that, Ryo-san. I am mindful that I think we're a bit behind schedule, so I'm going to try and answer both of your questions as succinctly as possible. Firstly, yes, to take your second question first, I do think that there is growing awareness of the importance of international humanitarian law and the risks that companies and investors face if they were to not, if they were to be in violation of IHL. That being said, I do think that this varies from sector to sector, from company to company. And indeed, if we're thinking about, let's say, medium and small-sized businesses compared to the larger firms, then there will clearly be differences in understanding as well. And so it is very important that we must further embed understandings of international humanitarian law into business practices. And the guiding principles, of course, also acknowledge that it is very important that any enterprise operating in an armed conflict situation, that it should respect the standards established by IHL. I would say, if I can quickly just spotlight the financial sector in particular, I think there has been growing interest and growing awareness that it is important for investors to focus on heightened human rights due diligence. But when it comes to incorporating international humanitarian law, again, there is still a gap. With respect to your first question about the mechanisms that exist to hold companies accountable when they fail to comply with international humanitarian law, I'd say currently we need to look at the developments at the domestic level. There are countries that have passed national legislation that permits businesses to be held responsible for the commission of or complicity in war crimes. And we have seen cases already. If you think about Lafarge vis-a-vis Syria, the Ford case in Argentina, the Chiquita case in Colombia, all of these examples, I think, are pointing to how there is now a lot of movement and a basis for corporations, for businesses, and the individuals connected to them to be charged with war crimes or for violating international humanitarian law. So I would say that all is not lost in that regard. There are mechanisms, and indeed, we're also seeing civil litigation being used increasingly as a way to also ensure that victims receive remedies, redress for violations of IHL. So taken together, yes, it is still a long way ahead for us in terms of ensuring that businesses are adequately held to account for their complicity in conflict related crimes, human rights abuses, but there is some progress.
Hello, everyone. I think it's my time to come in here and start the Q&A session. I want to first thank the panelists for giving really excellent answers, provocative and strong questions and answers to each other. We only have about 10 minutes for Q&A. We have many great questions that have come in. A few of them are specific to one geographic area and some of them are more general. So I'm going to just start with one of the specific geographic questions and go back to our keynote speaker, Marwa Fatafta from Access Now, and ask, there was a question that came in, is there any emerging legal analysis concerning corporate complicity in the ongoing genocide in Gaza in terms of international human rights law or evolving EU tech legislation, for example, the AI Act or GDPR? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Heather, and thanks for the question. So I want to preface by saying or reiterating what Peshman said, that when it comes to the tech sector, the rules and the guidance is often is lagging. And so from my experience, there's been very little understanding from company side, even among civil society, about how the rules of war, how international criminal law apply to the conduct of companies. And so I would say pretty much over the past 2 years, there's been increasing interest in this field, and there's multiple efforts underway, I should say, of analyzing the conduct of businesses, and particularly I can talk, about tech companies under IHL and ICL. When it comes to national or regional law, it's interesting that you mentioned the AI Act and the GDPR. We see a completely different conduct from states. Ironically, in January this year, the European Commission provided Israel with an adequacy decision under its GDPR, which basically means it recognizes that Israel has the same data protection safeguards the EU has, which under all the revelations we now know, when it comes to mass surveillance, when it comes to illegal settlements, when it comes to the forceful extraction of personal information, all sorts of data protection abuses, it's quite disheartening, and to see such a decision come to place, completely dismissing the concerns that civil society have raised in the documentation we have. It's also quite ironic to mention that I think very recently Israel has joined the Council of Europe's first binding treaty on AI and human rights and democracy. To me, that again normalizes those right abusing practices, and we need to, at least for civil society, to interrogate and push back on where these rules are being bent for geopolitical reasons. So just to wrap up, to say, yes, there is a lot of brain power being put right now by different partners just to analyze and hopefully leading to some accountability results in the future. I will hand it back to you, Heather.
Thank you very much, Marwa. I'm going to ask a question and see which of our panelists would like to answer it. This came in from another participant. A recent fact-finding report by the Freedom House and several other organizations has characterized the displacement of the entire ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh by Azerbaijan a year ago as ethnic cleansing. The host of this year's COP29, Azerbaijan, is attracting foreign investment into Nagorno-Karabakh, while at the same time, the homes and the cultural heritage of those displaced are being destroyed, eliminating any hope for their return to their ancestral land. What responsibility is carried by business investing there? Could they play a role in contributing to the stability in the region instead? Who would like to take that one?
I'm not sure if any others have put their hand up, but if not, then I'm happy to take the first.
Please do,
Okay.
Fishamon. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And thank you for an excellent question. I will reiterate here that from the perspective of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, we advocate businesses to undertake heightened human rights due diligence to better understand and address both the potential and actual human rights impacts that they can have. And so in relation to your question, yes, businesses can indeed play a positive role. But in order to play a positive role, they also have to understand, as has been pointed out many times, that they will never be a neutral actor. They can be an impartial actor, but that's not quite the same, right? And so in light of that, they have to conduct heightened human rights due diligence in order to better understand what their adverse impacts can be, prevent or mitigate them, and in so doing, ensure that they can have a positive impact on the civilian population. I think there are many more aspects, obviously, to the complexity on the ground, to the case that was asked. But I would say that as a general principle, the UN guiding principles make it very clear that businesses, no matter where they're operating, no matter their size or the sector that they're operating within, all of them have a responsibility to respect human rights.
Thank you very much, Pishamon. I'm now going to ask a more general question. One of the questions that came in was, in fragile and conflict-affected areas, it's very difficult to collect data. What are your recommendations for researchers to collect data to contribute to this process of enforcing human rights? I wonder if my colleague from the Resource Center might have an answer, or others.
I can just add, it's even if businesses are is mostly or focus area, but I think it's engaging with the civil society on the ground is important. But we do understand that there might be a lot of obstacles, and I think this is one of the consequence implications of ongoing war, that you are being distracted by collecting data. But on the other hand, we have also seen that for a lot of the civil society, the information would have been in the public domain if it wouldn't have been for civil society. So I think the role civil society plays is quite vital, both for us as investors, but for other actors as well.
Thank you. And Marwa, I think you have an idea as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to also jump in and confirm that indeed civil society, whether it be local organizations, grassroots activists, or even global ones, are always open to, first of all, they do thorough documentation of human rights abuses or atrocity crimes on the ground. And they're always open and willing to provide that information to companies that are willing also to engage. And I think that this is where often the missing link is, not having meaningful engagement, not approaching civil society, or not responding to civil society to get that information.
Thank you. And I might urge my philanthropy sector colleagues on this webinar to think also about putting more resources into this question of resourcing local organizations to collect and disseminate data, because I think that's often an underfunded area. I'm going to ask one more question. I'm not sure who would like to answer it. On potentially a more positive note, is there potential in the business sector for preventing armed conflict, for example, by helping identify and address root causes of conflict early on? I wonder if anyone can think of examples of that, because there are so many of examples of business not acting early enough. Any examples anyone wants to share of ideas for root cause addressing?
I'll just quickly jump in, I suppose, first to say that, there are initiatives like the Business for Peace, which focuses on, which brings together businesses that are committed to paying heightened attention to the implementation of the UN Global Compact, in conflict-affected areas. So there are such initiatives, and I'm sure there are other examples where businesses, including small ones, when we think about the post-conflict stage, it is often the case that those businesses that remain, that have to remain, are also instrumental to building up the necessary social infrastructure in conflict-affected situations. And so I suppose the one thing I will say, though, and this perhaps contradicts the positive tone of the question, is just that for the guiding principles, we do say that a business can have a positive impact. It can engage in, acts of philanthropy or charity and a range of other things. But that does not offset in any way the adverse impacts that they can potentially or actually have. And so in light of that, it's still important for businesses to engage in human rights due diligence or heightened human rights due diligence in conflict settings to ensure that they are not contributing to adverse human rights harm, and that they are in fact contributing to mitigating or preventing those harms. But I'll leave it there and hand it to others.
Thank you. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question to Kieran. I want to thank you first for your reflections, what you've said today. There's a question that came in the case where Caterpillar and other companies have been directly linked to human rights abuses in illegal settlements and the potential linking of all investors in Caterpillar and human rights abuse. Why do you think other investors haven't taken action to escalate and divest? Again, given the very real potential that they're also now directly linked or even contributing to these human rights abuses. And what do you think would spur action from the investment community on this?
I would say that, a lot of the investors, they have exposure to the US market, and the public opinion in the US is quite difficult compared to the European context. And I think this is why a lot of the investors and companies face a lot of pressure. So this is at least my reflection based on the conversation I have had with various actors. And one thing, and the other thing is that normally that people, that you will you would rather have some controversies than getting a state as Israel pressurized. So I think I would say that's the main reason.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I'm going to hand back to Phil Bloomer in a minute, but I just want to end by thanking the panelists and thanking the audience. I want to encourage you to continue the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag BHR Speaker Series and hashtag BizHumanRights with a Z, and to follow the Resource Center's handles on social media, BHRRC on X and Facebook, and the Business and Human Rights Resource Center on LinkedIn. Phil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Heather. That's great. And thank you to all the panelists, and of course to Marwa as well as Volker and Mary. I think this has been an extraordinary panel. I think we've got real opportunities now. We've heard from the panelists that we have all the means, we have the policy, we have the practice, we have the guidance in place in ways that can really end abuse and ensure that companies and investors can avoid complicity in war crimes, in crimes against humanity, international humanitarian law, international human rights law. And we can start to use business and investors indeed in ways that can really generate that alternative fork in the road that Volker spoke about, the alternative towards peace, towards justice, towards security. And in each of those situations, of course, we reduce the enormous human suffering that's being generated. And we also create the conditions in which responsible businesses thrive rather than irresponsible ones. I want to just finish really by highlighting a couple of points that I think have come out. The first one is just that issue of the fact that we now have entered a cyber age where technology and the military have really integrated in so many different ways, both in terms of physical destruction as well as in terms of psychological operations. And that we've got a situation, therefore, where, in Gaza, as in Russia, we have extraordinary levels of physical destruction, but we also have that are being supported and by the actions and supply chains and value chains of many corporate giants. But we also have a situation in countries such as Nagorno-Karabakh, in regions such as Nagorno-Karabakh and countries such as DRC, Sudan, Myanmar, where mining and manufacture are also playing a fundamental role in supporting those that are prosecuting the harm and human suffering that's being generated. I do think there's, as I said, real grounds for optimism. We've heard about the fundamental role of transparency, the fundamental role of accountability. And I have to say that I think this move and the global movement that we need for heightened human rights due diligence is essential. After all, the human rights due diligence is an extraordinarily powerful tool, particularly in sectors that are moving at hyperspeed, such as tech and arms, because it puts the onus it puts the burden of reviewing the way in which the consequences of the deployment of these technologies, it puts that burden onto the companies and onto the investors. When now those sectors are moving so fast, that form of regulation is so much more important because it demands they anticipate the harms rather than regulators constantly trying to catch up with what is a constantly receding frontier. So from that perspective, I do believe that we've got an extraordinarily powerful tool at our available to us. And I think we need to really ensure that regulators, policymakers, parliamentarians around the world understand the power that they have to deliver on this. But as Rio and Kiran and all the others have pointed out, business itself has a fundamental role to play. And to hear the kind of leading businesses that we've heard today standing alongside Pitchamon and Marwa and Ella to really highlight what is necessary, I think has been inspiring to everybody. So in the hope that we can we can choose that right fork in the road, it's an international movement that we need. We're part of that international movement together, and we have an extraordinary challenge over the coming years in that regard. So I want to just finish by thanking, obviously, Mary and Volker, Marwa, Pitchamon, Kiran, Rio and Ella, as well as Chris and Heather for their support, the Resource Centre, the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre team, which has done extraordinary work in pulling this together, as well as our interpreters, and of course you, the audience. Thank you very much to everybody.